Hey everyone, Hamish here once again, and welcome to my review of East of Eden by John Steinbeck. This book was published in 1952, and it's my second foray into the work of Mr. Steinbeck, the first being Of Mice and Men. This book is quite dissimilar to East of Eden, most notably on account of its length. Of Mice and Men is a novella, it is very short, whereas East of Eden is probably one of the most voluminous books I've ever met. My edition comes in at over 600 pages. Also, whilst Of Mice and Men is centered on the interactions between two people, this book is intergenerational. It tracks the dynasty of the Trask family, as well as the Hamilton family, and so there is a lot more information, and there are a lot more characters condensed into this tome. Both books, however, share a setting, the Salinas Valley of California. I understand that John Steinbeck was born and raised there, and it's quite plain that he draws a lot of inspiration from that landscape. The entire first chapter of East of Eden is dedicated to evoking the scene, and he goes into a lot of detail, even about the flowers and how they can appear seasonally. I recall immediately being struck by Steinbeck's powers of description, and I'd say that that's one of my favourite elements of East of Eden. The way that Steinbeck can craft this splendid evocation of a landscape I don't really know anything about, and yet I truly can see it through my own eyes once he's had his way. Yet after he establishes the Salinas Valley as this beautiful and idyllic place, Steinbeck shifts the focus of this novel all the way over to Connecticut, which is where the narrative initially develops. We meet the Trask family. There is Cyrus, the godhead and father of the family, who truly does oppress his two children, Charles and Adam. Adam, I would say, is the main character of this story. I'm a bit reluctant to call him the protagonist, as he doesn't really incite any action here. He spends most of the book just trying to bear all the calamities that fall upon him, but he really is the center of this, and in a way, East of Eden is his journey. But anyway, these opening scenes are really occupied by a single theme, and it's a foreshadowing for what is going to appear later in this novel. I'm sure you've heard that this book mirrors the myth of Cain and Abel, the story in Genesis, where the two brothers vied for their father's love, the father being God, and then because one felt neglected, he actually went and slew the other. Well, something similar does occur here. Adam is absolutely adored by Cyrus for no real reason, and Charles, the other brother, feels so neglected that this neglect eventually turns to madness, and he attempts to murder Adam. You will certainly notice if you read this novel that father-son relationships are explored in quite some depth. Steinbeck, as the narrator, tends to be quite subtle about this, but the paternal bond is really significant here. Early on in the novel, before it moves back to Salinas, we're also introduced to the character of Kathy. The narrator describes her in the most vehement terms, as a monster, as being truly inhuman. In fact, there's a single line here which really caught my attention. There was a time when a girl like Kathy would have been called possessed by the devil. She would have been exorcised to cast out the evil spirit, and if after many trials that did not work, she would have been burned as a witch for the good of the community. And yet she is a really dominant figure in this book. She exists as the negative polarity to Adam, who I should mention is the fundamental good guy here. I must say though, for someone who was meant to be the embodiment of evil, Kathy never really managed to frighten me or disquiet me in any significant way. Now, I'm not sure if I can attribute that to Steinbeck's writing style, or just the fact that he didn't intend it to be that way, but personally, as the reader, it almost seemed like the narrator's first appraisal of her was a little bit overstated. I mean, she's really awful, don't get me wrong, but she doesn't seem like the devil incarnate or anything. It's once the story returns to the Salinas Valley that East of Eden really begins to unfold as a work of art. Two characters are made known to us. Samuel Hamilton, who is a wise, judicious, but not all-knowing Irishman, and then Lee, who is the humble and persistent servant of Adam. These two characters are so superbly portrayed. Every single thing they say is authentic and meaningful, and if there were two characters that I would like to have a conversation with from all the books I've ever read, they would be very high up on my list. The way in which Steinbeck describes their first encounter says a lot about these characters' relationship. Lee, as a Chinese servant, is accustomed to talking in pidgin English, generally because it's what the white folk expect from him. Yet Samuel has the perspicacity to pick up the fact that Lee is actually masquerading. He's not being his true intelligent self, and this is the encounter. Lee grinned. "Me talky Chinese talk," he said. "Well, I guess you have your reasons, and it's not my affair. I hope you'll forgive me if I don't believe it, Lee," says Samuel. Lee looked at him, and the brown eyes under their rounded upper lids seemed to open and deepen until they weren't foreign anymore, but man's eyes, warm and understanding. Lee and Samuel are the resident philosophers of this novel. It is they who are responsible for pushing it outside the boundaries of the Salinas Valley into territory that is very human and open to all of us. The core of their philosophy is in the word timshel. Timshel is Hebrew for thou mayest, and this simple word forms the crux of East of Eden. It was Lee who discovered it. He was reading alternate translations of the Bible, and he noticed a slight discrepancy between the translations. Some said, "thou shalt," some said, "do thou," and others said, "thou mayest," and he drew enormous consequences from this. I quote, "There are many millions in their sects and churches who feel the order, 'do thou,' and throw their weight into obedience. And there are millions more who feel predestination in 'thou shalt.' Nothing they may do can interfere with what will be. But 'thou mayest.' Why, that makes a man great. That gives him stature with the gods. For in his weakness and his filth and his murder of his brother, he still has great choice. He can choose his course and fight it through and win." Lee's voice was a chant of triumph. Within that passage we find the essence of this book. Steinbeck is expressing that man has one decision to make, the decision between good and evil. Nothing else can define him. Later on, the narrator further expounds this concept. I quote, "We have only one story. All novels, all poetry, are built on the never-ending contest in ourselves of good and evil. And it occurs to me that evil must constantly respawn, while virtue is immortal. Vice has always a new, fresh face, while virtue is venerable as nothing else in the world is." And so, fundamentally, in this book, the Salinas Valley is a battleground between vice and virtue. There are those who are inherently good, like Adam. There are those who are inherently evil, like Kathy. And then there are those who are in the middle, and that's where Steinbeck really takes his focus. One of those people is Samuel. And as I said, Samuel is wise, he's judicious, but he doesn't know everything. And he actually exercises his timshel, his freedom of choice, and it seems so out of character to Lee that Lee is actually inspired to say the following: "Samuel, you've gone beyond me." It is the individual struggle between benevolence and malevolence that Steinbeck finds most admirable. This of course culminates in the character of Cal, who is seemingly destined to enact the fate of Cain by slaying his own brother. I won't go into details here, but the ending is the purest expression of 'thou mayest' there is. Now I realize this review might have morphed into a bit more of an analysis, and I don't want to dampen anything I've said. I truly think this is an amazing book, but I did find Steinbeck's writing at points to be a little bit long-winded. He tends to digress a fair bit, and most of the time I really like it because, as I said before, he has such powers of description. But some characters were introduced and then faded away. Some scenes were set and then never really lived in. And so I did think that there were possibly a few unnecessary pages in this book. Nonetheless, I found this to be a really fulfilling read, and I would highly recommend it to you. I read that Steinbeck said there was one book to a man, and East of Eden was his book. Well, it might just have happened that whilst he was composing it, he experienced what he describes in the novel as a moment of glory. I quote, "A man may have lived all his life in the grey, and the land and trees of him dark and sombre. The events, even the important ones, may have trooped by faceless and pale. And then, the glory. So that a cricket's song sweetens his ears, the smell of the earth rises chanting to his nose, and dappling light under a tree blesses his eyes. Then a man pours outwards, a torrent of him, and yet he is not diminished." I hope you've enjoyed my review of East of Eden. Please let me know in the comments what you think of this book, whether your interpretation of its themes is similar or different to mine, and I'm also going to leave you with a few questions to consider. Like Steinbeck, do you think man's existence is based on that fundamental choice between good and evil? Do you even believe that man has the choice to make? I would love to hear your responses. I'll see you next time, and I'll link to my Facebook page in the description. Thanks for watching.